Hey there. You know how we all crave that feeling of safety at home? Like it's our sanctuary, our haven. Well, today, we're taking a look at the dark side of that, exploring what happens when the place we're supposed to feel safest becomes anything but. We've got some truly chilling true crime stories for you, dealing with home invasions and stalking. Fair warning, these are intense. But they're also reminders that while knowledge can be unsettling, it can also be empowering.
Absolutely. And while we're delving into some heavy stuff, it's important to remember these stories, while terrifying, are thankfully not the everyday experience for most people. But by understanding the tactics and psychology behind these crimes, we can be better prepared to protect ourselves.
Exactly. So buckle up because this first story starts out almost innocently. Picture this, you're 10 years old, you've just moved to a new town, and you make a friend with a girl your age. Seems like the perfect start, right? Until one December night, things take a horrifying turn.
What's so disturbing about this case is how it highlights the calculated nature of some predators. The source material mentions the intruder was recently released from a mental health facility and had been meticulously observing the victim's routine. It's a chilling reminder that those who intend harm can often mask their intentions, appearing harmless.
It's like something out of a nightmare, someone watching, waiting for the right moment. And tragically, this story doesn't have a happy ending. Just a week before Christmas, the intruder took the girl's life.
It's a stark reminder that we need to be vigilant about the safety of children, especially in seemingly safe environments. This case isn't about scaring parents, but rather about empowering them. Background checks for anyone regularly interacting with your children, no matter how harmless they seem, can be a crucial step. And teaching kids about stranger danger needs to go beyond just strangers. It's about understanding that adults can sometimes have bad intentions, even those they might know casually.
That's a really good point. We often focus on the stranger aspect, but sometimes the danger can be closer to home, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And that's what makes our next story even more unsettling. It involves someone who is supposed to be a protector, a figure of authority, a neighbor boy who developed a dangerous obsession with a young girl living nearby.
Okay. Yeah, this one is really tough to hear. The source mentions the boy starting with seemingly innocent actions, asking questions, hanging around her house more often. It's easy to brush these things off as just being a curious kid, but in hindsight, there are glaring red flags.
Exactly. And what's even more troubling is that when some adults notice these behaviors, they dismiss them. It wasn't until the boy went missing that the full extent of his actions became clear. They found him hiding in the girl's closet, watching her sleep.
Oh my gosh, that is horrifying. It's like a real-life boogeyman situation.
Oh.
The fear we have as kids that there's something lurking in the shadows is actually realized. It makes you wonder, how often are these warning signs missed or downplayed?
More often than we'd like to admit. This case underscores a deeply troubling aspect of our society. We sometimes minimize or rationalize inappropriate behavior toward children, especially when it comes from someone we know. This story needs to be a wake-up call. We need to create environments where kids feel safe speaking up and where adults take their concerns seriously, no matter who the perpetrator might be.
That's so crucial. It's about shifting our mindset from reactive to proactive, right? Instead of waiting for something terrible to happen, we need to be actively creating safe spaces for children and empowering them to speak up if something feels wrong.
Precisely. And that empowerment needs to extend to adults as well. Because in our next story, we see how a seemingly strong, independent woman found herself targeted by a stalker.
This story is about a grandmother who was widowed but still lived a full life walking home from the library at dusk, volunteering, not letting anything hold her back. But one evening, her routine walk took a very dark turn.
This story taps into a primal fear, the feeling of being watched, of being followed. The source mentions the stalker taking a gradual approach, getting closer each time, increasing the victim's sense of dread and helplessness. It's a classic tactic designed to instill terror and make the victim feel completely powerless.
You can practically feel the tension building, right? But here's where things take a really interesting turn. This woman was prepared. She always carried a .38 revolver. And when the stalker made his move, demanding her purse and threatening her, she didn't hesitate. She pulled out the gun and shot him.
Now, this situation raises some complex questions about self-defense, especially using deadly force. Legally speaking, using a firearm in self-defense is a very nuanced area. It varies from state to state, and it hinges on whether the person reasonably believed they were in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm.
That makes sense. It's not as simple as, I felt threatened, so I shot. There's a whole legal process that comes after, right? And I imagine the psychological impact of taking a life, even in self-defense, must be immense.
Absolutely. Taking a human life is a profoundly traumatic experience. Regardless of the circumstances, there's often guilt, second-guessing, and the potential for PTSD. Accessing resources like trauma therapy and legal counsel is vital in these situations.
It really makes you think about the weight of those split-second decisions, the
Yeah.
long-term consequences, and the ripple effect it has on everyone involved. Speaking of feeling uneasy, our final story for this part of the deep dive deals with that creeping sensation of being watched. It involves a white SUV and a teenage girl babysitting her younger sibling.
This story highlights the importance of trusting your gut instinct. The source described how this SUV kept appearing at the end of their driveway, windows blacked out, and it would slowly creep closer whenever the girl stepped outside. This went on for weeks until it suddenly stopped, only to reappear months later, seemingly bolder than before.
It's like something out of a horror movie. The car becomes this symbol of lurking danger. And even though they never saw the driver, the psychological impact must have been huge. It's a violation of that sense of safety you're supposed to have at home.
Exactly. The white SUV is almost a trope in these situations, representing the unknown, the unseen danger that could be lurking anywhere. What's crucial here is that the girl's intuition was screaming that something was wrong. Often our subconscious picks up on signals our conscious mind might miss. We need to learn to trust those gut feelings. If something feels off, it probably is.
It's like that old saying, better safe than sorry, right? But you know, it's interesting. Her father, who was a police officer, had a completely different reaction. He grabbed his gun and went outside to confront whoever was in the SUV, but it sped off, and they never saw it again.
Now, that brings up a really important point about how we respond to these situations. While the father's protective instincts are understandable, directly confronting a potential stalker can be incredibly dangerous. It's important to remember that stalkers are often driven by a desire for control and power, and confrontation can escalate the situation.
So what's the best course of action in a situation like that? I mean, you want to feel safe in your own home, but you also don't want to put yourself in danger.
You're right, it's a delicate balance. The most important thing is to document everything. Keep a log of every incident, dates, times descriptions, anything you can remember. This creates a record that can be invaluable if you need to involve law enforcement. And speaking of law enforcement, don't hesitate to contact them if you feel threatened or believe you are being stalked.
That's a good reminder. Sometimes we hesitate to involve the police because we think we're overreacting or that it's not serious enough. But when it comes to our safety, it's always better to err on the side of caution.
Absolutely. And remember, stalking isn't always about physical danger. It can also manifest as harassment, cyberstalking, unwanted contact. And all of these behaviors can have a devastating impact on someone's life. The key takeaway is that if you feel threatened, trust your instincts, document everything, and reach out for help.
Great advice. And I think this is a perfect place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground already, from seemingly harmless situations turning deadly to the importance of trusting our gut instincts.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Exactly. So stay tuned, because in part 2 of this deep dive, we'll be exploring even more chilling stories and unpacking the psychology behind these unsettling crimes. We'll also be discussing practical steps you can take to enhance your safety and protect yourself and your loved ones.
Welcome back. I know we left off on a somewhat unsettling note, but as we continue this deep dive, it's important to remember that knowledge is power. By understanding these disturbing situations, we can better equip ourselves to navigate the world safely.
That's a great point. It's not about living in fear, but about being informed and proactive, right?
Precisely. And our next story really underscores that idea of being proactive. It involves a woman who found herself living a nightmare scenario,
Yeah.
constantly looking over her shoulder, never knowing when the threat might reappear.
This story is about a single mom who started noticing a pattern whenever she left her apartment. A specific car seemed to be following her. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, but the same car kept showing up, parked across the street from her work, even at her son's school.
This case highlights a particularly insidious form of stalking. It's not always about overt threats or physical violence. It's about creating an atmosphere of fear, a constant sense of unease. That can be incredibly psychologically damaging.
It's like that feeling you get when you think someone is watching you, but you can't quite prove it. It plays with your mind. It makes you question your own sanity. And in this case, the stalker would leave these bizarre gifts on her doorstep: dead flowers, a broken mirror, things that were clearly meant to intimidate and unsettle her.
These types of actions are often symbolic, meant to convey a message of power and control. The stalker wants the victim to know they're always watching, that they can invade her space even when she's supposed to feel safe.
It's just so creepy. You'd think in a situation like that, the obvious answer would be to move right, get as far away from the stalker as possible. But the source mentions that she couldn't afford to move and felt trapped.
That's one of the heartbreaking realities of stalking. It often targets those who are already vulnerable financially, emotionally, or socially. Moving isn't always an option, which makes it even more crucial to document everything and involve law enforcement.
So in a case like this, what can someone do? I mean, besides documenting everything and calling the police, are there any practical steps to take to feel safer?
Absolutely. One of the most important things is to create a safety plan. This includes identifying safe places you can go if you feel threatened, having a code word with trusted friends or family members, and practicing what you would do in different situations.
That's a great idea. It's like having a fire drill for your personal safety. And it probably helps to empower you, knowing that you have a plan in place.
Exactly. And there are also technological tools that can be helpful. Security cameras, personal safety apps, even something as simple as sharing your location with trusted contacts can provide an added layer of security and peace of mind.
It's amazing how technology can be both a blessing and a curse in these situations. On the one hand, it can be used by stalkers to track and harass. But on the other hand, it can also be a powerful tool for victims to protect themselves and seek help.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about reclaiming that sense of agency, using technology to your advantage rather than letting it be used against you. And that brings us to our next story, which deals with the very real danger of technology being used for malicious purposes.
This one is about a college student who became the target of a relentless cyberstalker. It started with harassing messages on social media, but then escalated to fake profiles being created in her name, posting embarrassing photos and personal information.
Cyberstalking is a growing problem, and it can be just as damaging as traditional stalking. It can ruin reputations, damage relationships, and lead to real-world harm. And what makes it particularly insidious is that it can happen to anyone, anywhere, with just a few clicks.
It's like the internet becomes this breeding ground for anonymity and cruelty. You think you're safe behind a screen, but the reality is that anyone can become a target. In this case, the stalker went as far as hacking into the student's email and bank accounts, essentially taking over her digital life.
And that's why it's so important to be vigilant about online security. Strong passwords, two-factor authentication, and being cautious about what information you share online are crucial steps in preventing cyberstalking.
You know, it's ironic. We're told to share everything online to build our brand and our following, but the more we put out there, the more vulnerable we become. It's a tough balance to strike.
You're right. It's about finding that sweet spot between being present online and protecting your privacy. And if you do become the target of cyberstalking, it's crucial to document everything: screenshots, URLs, timestamps, anything that can be used as evidence.
Because the internet can feel so ephemeral, right? Like things disappear as quickly as they appear. But having that documentation can be key in holding the perpetrator accountable. And I imagine law enforcement is still catching up when it comes to cybercrime, right?
That's a valid point. Cybercrime is a relatively new frontier for law enforcement, and the laws are constantly evolving. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't report it. In fact, reporting cyberstalking is essential in helping authorities understand the scope of the problem and develop better strategies for combating it.
It's like anything else, the more we talk about it, the more awareness we raise, the better equipped we'll be to deal with it. And that brings us to our final story for this part of the deep dive, which focuses on a threat that emerged from an unexpected source, a family friend.
This case is particularly disturbing because it highlights how stalkers can exploit trust and familiarity. The source mentions a woman who had been close friends with a couple for years. When the husband passed away, she naturally wanted to support her friend. But the widow's behavior became increasingly possessive and erratic.
It's like that saying, good fences make good neighbors right. But in this case, there were no fences, just years of shared history and a sense of obligation. And the source describes how the widow started showing up uninvited at the woman's house, making accusations, even threatening her children.
This behavior is often rooted in jealousy and insecurity, or a desperate need for control. The stalker may feel threatened by the victim's relationship's success, or even their happiness.
It's like they're trying to sabotage the victim's life to bring them down to their level. And in this case, the widow went as far as spreading rumors about the woman, trying to damage her reputation within their social circle.
That's another common tactic used by stalkers. They try to isolate the victim from their support system, making them more vulnerable and dependent.
So what do you do in a situation like this? I mean, when the threat comes from someone you once trusted, someone you thought was a friend?
It's a challenging situation for sure. But it's important to remember that you have the right to set boundaries, even with people you care about. Clearly communicate that their behavior is unacceptable and that you will not tolerate it.
But what if they don't listen? What if they continue to harass and stalk?
Then you need to take steps to protect yourself, just like you would with any other stalker.
Hmm.
Document everything, report it to the police if necessary, and consider obtaining a restraining order.
It's heartbreaking when a friendship turns toxic like that, but it's a reminder that sometimes self-preservation has to come first. And that's a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll be discussing the psychological impact of these experiences and exploring ways to heal and reclaim your sense of safety. We've covered some truly unsettling territory in this deep dive, stories that highlight the darker side of human behavior and the very real threats that exist out there. But before we wrap up, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the emotional and psychological impact of these experiences.
That's an essential part of the conversation. While we've focused on practical safety tips and understanding the dynamics of stalking and home invasion, it's crucial to acknowledge the lasting trauma these events can inflict.
Exactly. It's not just about physical safety, but about emotional and mental well-being too. The source material mentions that many victims of stalking and home invasion experience symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance. It can really shift your sense of security and trust in the world.
Absolutely. Imagine having your safe space violated, the place where you're supposed to feel most secure, turned into a source of fear. It's a deeply unsettling experience that can have long-lasting consequences. Victims often struggle with feelings of vulnerability, powerlessness, and isolation.
It makes you question everything, right? Who you can trust, where you can feel safe, even your own judgment. And I imagine there's often a stigma attached to these experiences, like people don't understand what you're going through or think you're overreacting.
That's a really important point. There's often a sense of shame or self-blame associated with being a victim of these crimes. People might ask, why didn't you do this?
Yeah.
Or why didn't you see the signs? As if the victim is somehow responsible for what happened.
It's like blaming the victim instead of holding the perpetrator accountable. And that kind of response can make it even harder to heal and move forward. So what advice would you give to someone who's been through something like this? How can they start to reclaim their sense of safety and well-being?
First and foremost, it's essential to validate their experience. Acknowledge that what happened was real, that their feelings are valid, and that they're not alone in this. Seeking professional help from a therapist specializing in trauma can be incredibly beneficial. Therapy can provide a safe space to process the trauma, develop coping mechanisms, and work towards rebuilding trust and a sense of security.
That makes sense. Having a trained professional to guide you through those difficult emotions and help you make sense of what happened can be invaluable. Are there any other resources or support systems that can be helpful?
Absolutely. Support groups for victims of stalking and home invasion can provide a sense of community and shared understanding. Connecting with others who have been through similar experiences can be incredibly validating and empowering. There are also organizations dedicated to advocating for victims' rights, providing legal assistance, and raising awareness about these issues.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's hope and there's help available. You don't have to go through this alone. And I think it's also important to emphasize that healing is a process, not a destination. It takes time, it takes work, and there will be setbacks along the way.
You're absolutely right. There's no magic wand to erase the trauma, but with the right support and resources, it's possible to reclaim your life, your sense of self, and your feeling of safety in the world. And it's crucial to remember that even small steps forward are victories.
I love that perspective. It's about celebrating those small wins, acknowledging the progress you've made, and being kind to yourself throughout the healing journey. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the darkness we've explored, there's also a glimmer of hope, the knowledge that even in the face of fear and trauma, we have the capacity to heal, to grow, and to find strength in unexpected places.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and it's a message I hope our listeners will carry with them. Be vigilant, be aware, but don't let fear paralyze you. Trust your instincts. Take steps to protect yourself, and know that even if the unthinkable happens, you are not alone, and there is help available.
So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this intense but important journey. We hope this deep dive has provided you with valuable insights, practical tips, and a renewed sense of empowerment. Remember, knowledge is power. And by sharing these stories and engaging in these conversations, we can create a safer and more informed world for ourselves and our loved ones. Stay safe, everyone, and until next time, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.